Hauptmann Franz Dietrich, had flown this exact route 4 times before. Same altitude, same navigation points, same target at the end. The River Yeo curved 3 miles west of the factory, like a bent knife. Impossible to miss even in darkness. The town of Yeovil sat 2 miles south, its blackout streets still visible as a grid of darker shadows against dark fields. He knew every landmark between the coast and the Westland Aircraft Works. He could fly this approach, half asleep. Tonight he was not sleeping. Tonight something was wrong. Dietrich pressed his face closer to the bomber's window and scanned the ground below. Clouds had broken apart at 4,000 feet, giving him clear visibility for the first time in 3 missions. Moonlight painted the English countryside in shades of silver and black. Fields stretched in every direction, divided by hedgerows that looked like cracks in broken glass. He saw a road, a cluster of farm buildings, a line of trees along a stream. He did not see the factory. He checked his instruments. Airspeed correct, heading correct, time on target within 30 seconds of the briefing estimate. The mathematics put him directly over 11 acres of industrial buildings that produced 20 reconnaissance aircraft per week and employed 4,000 workers. His reconnaissance photos showed a massive rectangular structure with 3 tall chimneys and railroad tracks running into the southern loading docks. The factory was not small. It was not hidden in a valley. It sat on flat ground, surrounded by open farmland. But when Dietrich looked down, he saw farmland. Just farmland. He keyed his radio. The other 11 bombers in his formation were stacked behind him in a loose trail, their crews waiting for his signal to release payload. They had practiced this. 4 previous raids had taught them exactly where to aim, exactly when to drop, exactly how long to stay over target before anti-aircraft fire became dangerous. This was supposed to be routine. Dietrich told them to hold. He banked left and circled. Below him, nothing changed. The fields stayed fields. The farm buildings stayed farm buildings. No factory, no chimneys, no rail yard, no workers flooding out of shelters. No searchlights snapping on. Just quiet countryside, sleeping under moonlight like every other patch of England they had crossed in the last 2 hours. His co-pilot, a nervous young officer named Klaus, leaned over and pointed at the map. They were in the right place. Klaus was certain. Dietrich was also certain, but certainty did not explain what they were seeing, or not seeing. Dietrich circled again, lower this time, burning fuel they could not afford to waste. His bomber rattled as it descended to 2,500 feet. Anti-aircraft guns would open up any second if there was anything worth defending down there. But the guns stayed silent. The fields stayed empty. One of the other pilots broke radio discipline and asked what was happening. Dietrich did not answer because he did not have an answer. He had bombed bridges, docks, airfields, cities. He had navigated through storms, through smoke, through darkness, so complete. His instruments were the only proof he was still flying. He had never lost a target this large. He made a decision. There was an industrial area 2 miles east. Warehouses or storage sheds, something with metal roofs that reflected moonlight. It was not the Westland Works, but it was something. They would drop there and return to base. He gave the order. The formation released its bombs. 12 aircraft, full payload, 30 tons of high explosives. The munitions fell in a long scatter pattern across what turned out to be a collection of barns, pastures, and one unlucky farmhouse. Fires bloomed in 3 locations. Cows screamed, a roof collapsed, 0 strategic value. Dietrich flew home in silence. When he landed, he filed a report that used careful language to avoid sounding insane. He stated his navigation had been accurate. He stated the target was not where intelligence indicated. He suggested reconnaissance photos might be outdated or German maps might contain errors. He did not say the factory had vanished. He did not say he had circled over empty fields for 9 minutes, while his entire squadron watched him search for a building the size of a city block. But Oberst Heinrich Ritter read between the lines. Ritter commanded Kampfgeschwader 40 and had personally led 2 of the earlier raids on Westland. He knew Dietrich. Dietrich did not make navigation errors. Dietrich did not panic. Dietrich did not bomb random farms unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Ritter pulled every reconnaissance photo taken of the Westland Works in the last 3 months. He spread them across his desk in chronological order. January, February, March. He looked at them until his eyes burned. The January photos showed exactly what intelligence had described. A huge industrial complex, rectangular buildings with distinctive sawtooth roofs, 3 chimneys, rail tracks, everything sharp and geometric and impossible to miss from altitude. The February photos showed the same structures but with some changes. Roof damage from bombing raids, repair activity, nothing unusual. The March photos showed something else. Ritter leaned closer. The factory outline was still there if you knew what to look for. But the roofs no longer looked like roofs. They looked like patchwork, irregular sections of different shades. Dark brown here, light tan there, gray-green in between. The colors did not match each other. They did not match anything industrial, but they matched the fields around the factory, almost perfectly. Ritter grabbed a grease pencil and started tracing. He outlined every section of discolored roofing. He marked every new structure that had appeared on the factory grounds in March. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The British had not repaired their factory. They had repainted it. Every roof, every surface. They had turned 11 acres of industrial buildings into an imitation farm. Ritter sat back in his chair and laughed once, a short bark that was half admiration and half fury. The British had beaten his reconnaissance teams with paint. They had made an entire aircraft factory disappear by making it look like the dirt around it. He called in his photo analysis officer, a meticulous corporal named Ernst Weber, who had been studying reconnaissance images since 1940. Weber looked at the photos for 6 minutes without speaking. Then he pointed at a line running across one of the factory roofs. That was not a repair seam. That was a fake hedgerow. Weber started identifying other details. Wooden structures built on the rooftops that looked like small barns or sheds from above. Paint patterns that mimicked plowed fields and pastures. The 3 chimneys were gone. One had been disguised as a ruined building. The other 2 had been dismantled entirely. The rail tracks were the most clever part. They had not removed the tracks. They had covered them. Weber pointed at faint lines in the March photos that ran where the tracks used to be. The coverage was not perfect. If you knew to look for rails, you could still see ghost outlines. But a pilot flying at altitude, scanning for a factory while watching for fighters and flak, would see a dirt path or an overgrown farm road. Ritter asked how long this had taken. Weber estimated 6 weeks based on the progression visible in the photos. 6 weeks of painting, building fake structures, and redesigning the entire factory to blend into countryside. The British had done it while his bombers were still hitting them. Workers had been climbing onto roofs between raids, mixing colors, stretching canvas, constructing fake hedges, all while bombs were falling 2 or 3 times per week. Ritter wrote a detailed report to Luftwaffe High Command. He described the camouflage technique. He included photo comparisons. He recommended immediate updates to target intelligence and suggested low-altitude reconnaissance to verify current factory status. High Command acknowledged the report. They noted the technique for potential German defensive use. They did not authorize low-level reconnaissance because the losses would be unacceptable. And they quietly removed the Westland Aircraft Works from priority bombing lists. If a target required that much effort to locate, bomber crews could be used more efficiently elsewhere. Dietrich never flew that route again. The factory that had been marked on his maps as a guaranteed target, the building he could have navigated to in his sleep, was reclassified as low priority and eventually forgotten. Other targets took its place. Docks, rail yards, power stations, things that could not hide under patchwork paint. But Ritter kept one of the March reconnaissance photos, pinned to his office wall, not as a trophy, as a reminder. The British had turned a liability into an invisible asset using paint, wood, and desperation. They had made an 11-acre factory vanish by teaching it to look like nothing. And it had worked. 6 weeks earlier, the factory had been dying. Every raid brought more damage, more casualties, more delays in production. The mathematics were simple. At the current rate of attacks, Westland would stop functioning within 2 months. Lysander aircraft production would drop to zero. British reconnaissance missions across occupied Europe would lose their primary platform. The man who changed that was not a general. He was not an engineer. He was a 58-year-old civil defense volunteer named John Turner, who had spent 20 years managing tea plantations in India before the war. Turner had watched British survey planes photograph agricultural regions from altitude. He understood what fields looked like from 3,000 feet. He knew which colors appeared as which shades in reconnaissance photos. He knew how hedgerows broke up large spaces into smaller, irregular sections. He knew how scattered farm buildings disrupted geometric patterns. When the Westland factory director, James Abbott, held an emergency meeting to discuss German bombing raids, Turner attended as a low-ranking observer. He sat in the back of the room, while officers and engineers debated traditional solutions. Smoke generators, decoy structures, dispersing production to multiple sites. Every idea required resources Britain did not have, or time that was running out. Turner raised his hand and suggested they make the factory look like a farm. The room went silent. Then someone laughed. Abbott did not laugh. He asked Turner to explain. Turner walked to the front of the room and spread reconnaissance photos across the table. He pointed at the factory, then at the surrounding countryside. The Westland Works was a perfect rectangle, with straight edges and uniform roofing. It screamed industrial target to anyone with eyes. But the fields around it were chaos, irregular shapes, different colors depending on crop type and season. Brown where someone had plowed recently. Green where winter wheat was growing, gray where sheep had grazed the grass down to dirt. Scattered buildings with no pattern, hedgerows running in random directions. Turner asked a simple question. What if the factory stopped looking like a factory? He outlined his plan in 15 minutes. Paint the roofs in irregular patches to match surrounding field colors. Build fake hedgerows from wood and canvas to break up the rectangular outline. Disguise the chimneys. Cover the rail tracks. Construct fake farm buildings on the rooftops. Make the factory blend into the landscape so completely that a pilot flying overhead would see just another collection of agricultural plots. Someone asked how long it would take. Turner estimated 6 weeks if they started immediately. Abbott made his decision in under 2 minutes. He picked up the telephone and called the Ministry of Aircraft Production. By midnight, approval came through. By dawn, workers were mixing paint. The work started on February 21, 1943. Night shift crews climbed onto the factory roofs with brushes, rollers, and spray equipment. The color formulas came from analyzing dozens of reconnaissance photos to match the exact shades that appeared in real fields around Yeovil. The first section to be painted covered 2 acres in the northeastern corner. Workers applied irregular brown patches mixed with tan and gray. From ground level, it looked like someone had spilled paint. From 3,000 feet up, it looked like a plowed field next to a fallow pasture. German reconnaissance flights continued passing overhead every few days. Photo analysts noted the British appeared to be conducting roof repairs. No alarms were raised. The second week brought hedgerow construction. Carpenters built wooden frames 16 feet long and 4 feet high. Canvas was stretched across and painted to look like dense vegetation. The frames were hoisted onto the roofs and bolted down. When viewed from directly above, they created convincing boundaries that turned one large roof into 6 smaller, irregular sections. Problems appeared immediately. Wind tore canvas loose. Rain washed paint away. The fake chimney structure collapsed twice before engineers redesigned it with stronger internal bracing. Workers discovered that certain paint combinations looked perfect in daylight but turned the wrong shade under moonlight. Formulas had to be adjusted. People worked through air raid sirens. On March 3rd, a German bombing run hit the factory's western edge while workers were on the roof painting. 2 men died. The rest climbed back up the next night and kept working. By March 8th, the camouflage was 70% complete. Luftwaffe Reconnaissance photographed the site again. The lead analyst noticed significant changes, but concluded the British were installing anti-aircraft positions or repairing bomb damage with mismatched materials. By March 15th, when Dietrich flew his mission, the transformation was 90% finished. Most of the roof surface had been treated. Fake hedgerows crisscrossed the buildings. The chimneys were gone. Wooden track covers were in place and could be moved aside in under 3 minutes when supply trains arrived. From altitude, the Westland Aircraft Works looked like a random scattering of fields and farm buildings. Dietrich had circled over it for 9 minutes and seen nothing worth bombing. After that night, the raid stopped, not because Germany stopped wanting to destroy British aircraft production, but because Luftwaffe navigators could no longer reliably locate the target. The factory had been removed from mission planning boards, not because it was destroyed, but because it was invisible. Turner's paint job had accomplished what anti-aircraft guns and fighter squadrons could not. It had made the factory tactically irrelevant to German bombing strategy. Production continued without interruption. Workers entered through multiple small gates positioned around the perimeter, instead of flooding through one main entrance. From above, the scattered movement looked like farm laborers. Supply trains arrived at night, their cars covered with painted tarps that matched field colors. Smoke from the remaining chimney dispersed through the fake barn structure in thin wisps that looked like morning mist. The Westland Works built Lysander aircraft at full capacity for the rest of the war. German intelligence knew the factory still existed. They knew it was still producing planes, but they could not find it with enough certainty to justify sending bombers. Ritter kept that photo on his wall until 1945. Sometimes other officers would ask him about it. He would point at the patchwork roofs and fake hedgerows and say the same thing every time. The British turned their factory into a field using paint and wood, and we could not bomb a field we could not see. John Turner had not slept properly in 11 days. He sat at a wooden table in his rented room above a chemist shop in Yeovil, surrounded by reconnaissance photographs he was not supposed to have. The images were official Royal Air Force property, classified as sensitive intelligence. Turner had borrowed them from a liaison officer who owed him a favor and had not asked questions. That favor was now burning a hole in his conscience, but not enough to make him stop. He spread 6 photos across the table, under the light of a single desk lamp, all taken from different altitudes, all showing the same stretch of countryside around the Westland factory. He was not looking at the factory. He was looking at everything else: fields, hedgerows, farm buildings, the patchwork chaos of English agriculture that had grown without plan over centuries. He had spent 20 years in India managing tea plantations that covered thousands of acres. British survey planes had photographed those estates from the air for land management purposes. Turner had learned to read those images the way a fisherman reads water. He knew what textures meant, what crops. He knew how shadows fell across irregular boundaries. He knew what made a field look like a field instead of something pretending to be a field. He picked up a magnifying glass and moved it slowly across one photograph. A plowed section showed as dark brown with faint parallel lines from the tractor. A pasture appeared mottled gray-green where sheep had grazed unevenly. Winter wheat fields were lighter, almost tan in the February sun. The hedgerows were black jagged lines separating each section into irregular shapes that had no pattern, because farmers did not think in patterns. They thought in drainage, soil quality, and what their grandfather had planted 30 years ago. Turner set down the magnifier and picked up a photo of the Westland factory, taken the same day from the same altitude. The difference was obscene. Perfect rectangle, straight edges, uniform gray roofing material. It looked exactly like what it was. An industrial structure, built by engineers who cared about efficiency, not camouflage. Any pilot with working eyes could spot it in 3 seconds. He had been thinking about this problem for 6 weeks, ever since the first major raid. He had watched the factory burn from his window. He had counted the ambulances. He had read the casualty lists posted outside the town hall. 17 dead in the first attack, 9 in the second, 12 in the third. The numbers were climbing because German accuracy was improving with each raid. The ministry kept promising fighter cover and anti-aircraft reinforcements. Turner had stopped believing in promises. Fighters could not be everywhere at once. Guns could shoot down some bombers, but not all of them. The only real solution was to make the Germans stop wanting to bomb Westland in the first place. And the only way to do that was to make them think Westland did not exist. He pulled a blank sheet of paper toward him and started sketching. Not a technical drawing, just rough shapes. He outlined the factory roof as a rectangle, then started breaking it into smaller sections with irregular lines that mimicked field boundaries. He chose colors from memory. Dark brown for plowed earth, tan for fallow ground, gray-green for pasture. He marked where fake hedgerows would need to run to disrupt the geometric outline. The sketch looked insane. It looked like someone had taken a rational building and attacked it with a paintbrush and a fever dream. But when Turner held it at arm's length and squinted, the individual sections started to blend. The hard edges softened. The rectangle broke apart into something that could almost be agriculture if you were not looking too carefully. He set the sketch down and pressed his palms against his eyes. His head ached. His hands were cramping from holding the magnifier too long. He had been working on this idea for weeks without telling anyone, because he knew how it sounded. He was a 58-year-old tea plantation manager with no engineering degree and no military rank beyond volunteer civil defense coordinator. Who was he to propose camouflage solutions to people who built aircraft for a living? But he also knew something they did not. He knew what fields looked like from altitude because he had spent years managing land photographed from planes. He knew which colors worked and which did not. He knew how human eyes processed visual information when scanning quickly at 3,000 feet. The engineers at Westland were brilliant at building aircraft. They knew nothing about fooling aerial reconnaissance. Turner had attended the emergency meeting 3 days ago only because someone needed a civil defense representative in the room. He had sat in the back while senior officers debated smoke generators, decoy structures, and dispersing production to other sites. Every solution cost money Britain did not have or time that was running out. The factory director, James Abbott, looked like a man watching his life's work disintegrate, one raid at a time. Turner had raised his hand. His voice had cracked slightly when he started speaking, because 30 people turned to stare at him, and he suddenly felt like an idiot. He had said the factory should stop looking like a factory. Someone had laughed. Abbott had not laughed. Abbott had looked at him with the desperate eyes of a drowning man who would grab any rope thrown his direction. Now Turner sat in his rented room with stolen reconnaissance photos and a sketch that looked like the product of exhaustion and wishful thinking. He needed to make this real. He needed numbers, materials lists, and a work schedule that could survive scrutiny from engineers who would assume he had lost his mind. He started with the roof surface area. 11 acres. He converted that to square feet and felt his stomach drop. 479,000 square feet of roofing that needed to be repainted in irregular patterns. He calculated paint requirements based on coverage rates he remembered from estate maintenance in India. Gallons, hundreds of gallons in multiple colors mixed to exact specifications. Next came the fake hedgerows. He measured typical hedgerow heights and spacing from the reconnaissance photos. 4 feet tall, 16 feet between major sections. He sketched frame designs using lumber dimensions he knew were available from local mills. Canvas would be stretched across the frames and painted to look like dense vegetation. He estimated material costs and labor hours. The chimneys were the hardest problem. 3 tall brick structures pumping smoke during work shifts. Fields did not have chimneys. He considered several options. Dismantle them entirely, which would interrupt production. Cover them with netting, which would catch fire, or disguise them as ruined buildings. He settled on the third option. One chimney would be kept operational, but surrounded by a fake, collapsed barn structure that would allow smoke to escape through gaps in the false roof. The other 2 would be torn down. Railroad tracks were another issue. He could not remove them because the factory needed supply deliveries, but he could cover them with wooden panels painted to match dirt roads or overgrown paths. The panels would need to be movable, so trains could still access the loading docks. Worker movement was the final problem. 4,000 people entering and leaving through a single main gate created an obvious pattern visible from altitude. Turner proposed multiple small gates positioned around the factory perimeter. Workers would be distributed across entry points, so aerial observers would see scattered dots of movement that looked like farm laborers instead of a concentrated industrial workforce. He worked through the night adding details to his plan. By dawn, he had a 12-page document with sketches, calculations, and material requirements. His eyes burned. His handwriting had degraded into barely legible scrawl, but the plan was complete. He walked to Abbott's office at 8 in the morning without an appointment. The secretary tried to stop him. Turner ignored her and pushed through the door. Abbott looked up from a desk covered in damage reports and insurance paperwork. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the last month. Turner dropped the 12 pages on the desk and said they could make the factory invisible in 6 weeks if they started today. Abbott read for 20 minutes without speaking. His expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something that might have been hope. He asked how Turner knew this would work. Turner admitted he did not know for certain. He said it was based on aerial survey experience from India and analysis of German reconnaissance photos. He said the alternative was waiting for the next raid to kill more people and destroy more production capacity. Abbott picked up his telephone and called the Ministry of Aircraft Production. He described Turner's plan in blunt terms. Paint the factory to look like farmland. Build fake hedgerows, disguise the chimneys. Make the whole thing blend into the countryside. The person on the other end of the line must have asked if Abbott was joking, because Abbott's face hardened and he said 17 people had died in the first raid, and this was the first idea anyone had proposed that did not cost a fortune or take 6 months. The ministry put Abbott on hold for 40 minutes. Turner stood by the window and watched workers entering the factory for morning shift. Most of them had no idea how bad things were. Production targets were being met. Wages were being paid. But the German raids were getting more accurate. It was only a matter of time before a bomb hit the main assembly hall during work hours and turned hundreds of people into casualties. The ministry came back on the line and gave approval. Limited budget, 6-week deadline. If it failed, Abbott would take the blame. If it worked, someone in London would probably take the credit. Abbott did not care about credit. He thanked them and hung up. He looked at Turner and asked if he was certain about this. Turner said no. He said he was certain about the alternative, which was more coffins and less aircraft. Abbott nodded slowly and told him to start immediately. By noon, Turner was standing on the factory roof with 3 engineers who thought he was insane. The roof stretched in every direction, a vast expanse of uniform gray material that absorbed heat and reflected nothing but industrial purpose. One of the engineers pointed out that painting irregular camouflage patterns on this scale would require hundreds of workers and thousands of gallons of custom-mixed paint. Turner agreed. The engineer asked where they would find that many workers. Turner pointed down at the factory floor and said 400 people, currently building aircraft, could be temporarily reassigned to saving the factory that allowed them to build aircraft in the first place. The second engineer asked about color accuracy. How would they match the exact shades visible in reconnaissance photos? Turner admitted this was the hardest part. Paint that looked correct in daylight might appear wrong under moonlight when most German raids occurred. They would need to test multiple formulations and adjust based on results. Trial and error. The engineer shook his head and muttered that trial and error was not an engineering methodology. Turner lost his patience. He pointed toward the town and said, the methodology that was currently in use involved waiting for bombs to fall and then counting bodies. If anyone had a better plan, they should present it immediately. Otherwise, they should stop complaining and start mixing paint. The third engineer, a quiet man named Douglas who had been measuring roof sections with a tape measure, spoke up for the first time. He said the structural loading of the fake hedgerows would need to be calculated carefully. Wind forces on canvas, stretched across wooden frames, could generate significant pressure. If the frames were not properly anchored, they would tear loose during storms and expose the camouflage as artificial. Turner asked if Douglas could design frames that would hold. Douglas said yes. Turner told him to start designing. Work began that night. Turner had insisted on night shifts for two reasons. First, German reconnaissance flights usually passed over during daylight hours. Working at night reduced the chance of being photographed mid-construction. Second, factory production could continue during the day with minimal disruption. The first crew consisted of 40 workers, pulled from assembly line duties. Most of them were women because the majority of male workers had been conscripted. They climbed onto the roof, carrying brushes, rollers, and buckets of paint, mixed according to formulas Turner had calculated from the reconnaissance photos. The night was cold. Wind whipped across the exposed roofing material. Several women asked if this was really going to work or if they were just painting targets on themselves. Turner did not have a good answer. He told them to paint the northeastern section in irregular brown patches, mixed with tan and gray, matching the patterns he had marked with chalk earlier that day. The work was brutal. Roofing material was slippery. Wind knocked over paint buckets. Cold made brushes stiff and hard to control. By 3 in the morning, 2 acres had been painted. From the ground, it looked like someone had spilled paint randomly across the roof. Turner climbed down and walked 200 yards away to judge the effect from distance. Under moonlight, the painted section blended into shadow and texture that looked less like a building and more like uneven ground. It was not perfect, but it was different. It was no longer obviously industrial. He went back and told the crew to keep going. German reconnaissance flew over on the third day. Turner stood in the factory yard with binoculars and watched the plane pass at high altitude. A single-engine Messerschmitt making a long photo run. He could not tell if the pilot had noticed anything unusual. The plane did not circle back. It did not descend for a closer look. It just continued on its plotted course and disappeared into clouds to the east. 3 days later, Abbott received a copy of the German photo analysis report through intelligence channels. The report noted British appeared to be conducting roof repairs at the Westland Works, possibly addressing bomb damage. No change in threat assessment. No heightened alert. Turner read the report twice and allowed himself to believe for the first time that this might actually work. By the end of the first week, 4 acres had been painted, and the first fake hedgerows were under construction. Douglas had designed wooden frames using simple post and beam construction, anchored to the roof with bolted brackets. Canvas was stretched across the frames and coated with paint mixed to look like dense hedge vegetation. From ground level, the frames looked crude and fake. Turner did not care about ground level. He cared about 3,000 feet. Problems emerged constantly. Rain washed away some paint formulations that were not weather-resistant. Chemical additives had to be sourced and mixed in to improve durability. Canvas tore in high winds. Frames had to be reinforced with additional bracing and heavier gauge wire. One frame collapsed entirely during installation, nearly injuring 2 workers. Douglas redesigned the connection points and added redundant supports. The fake chimney barn was a disaster in its first iteration. The structure was supposed to look like a collapsed farm building with a damaged roof section that would allow smoke from the remaining active chimney to disperse. But the first design was too fragile. When the chimney was fired up for a test, heat warped the wooden beams and the whole structure sagged dangerously to one side. Douglas went back to his drafting table and redesigned it with fire-resistant materials and better ventilation. The second version held. On March 3rd, the Germans came back. It was 2 in the morning. No warning, just the sound of engines approaching from the coast. Air raid sirens wailed across Yeovil. Workers on the factory roof froze with paintbrushes in their hands. Someone yelled for everyone to get to the shelters. Most of them ran. 4 women stayed. They kept painting. Turner was in the factory yard when the first bombs fell. The western edge of the complex erupted in fire and flying debris. One bomb hit a storage shed and sent metal fragments scattering across the roof where the women were working. He screamed at them to get down. 2 of them dropped flat and covered their heads. The other 2 kept painting, moving their brushes across the roof sections with mechanical determination, as if finishing the pattern was more important than shrapnel. One of them was named Margaret. She was 42 years old and had 3 children. The other was named Elizabeth, 26, engaged to a soldier fighting in North Africa. Turner would learn their names later from the casualty list. A second bomb landed closer, cratering the yard 30 feet from where he stood. The blast wave knocked him onto his back and filled his lungs with dust. When he could see again through the smoke, Margaret and Elizabeth were not moving. The raid lasted 6 minutes. 3 bombs hit the factory grounds. Margaret and Elizabeth died on the roof. A third worker, a man named Thomas, who had been moving paint supplies near the loading dock, died from shrapnel wounds. 15 others were injured. Production halted for 8 hours to clear debris and treat wounded. Then it started again, because stopping meant the Germans won. Workers climbed back onto the roof that night. Nobody talked about Margaret or Elizabeth. They just picked up the brushes and kept painting the sections that had not been finished. Turner stood in the yard and watched them work. His hands were shaking, his ears were still ringing from the blast. He felt a sick, hollow guilt that he could not name. He had proposed this plan. He had put people on that roof. Margaret and Elizabeth had died painting camouflage that might not even work. If the next German reconnaissance flight photographed the factory and saw through the disguise, their deaths would be for nothing. Abbott found him an hour later. Abbott's face was gray. He asked if Turner wanted to stop. Turner said no. Abbott asked why not. Turner pointed at the roof where women were painting under dim work lights and said, because Margaret and Elizabeth had kept painting even when the bombs were falling. If he stopped now, he would be saying their decision to stay was meaningless. Abbott nodded and walked away without another word. By March 8th, 70% of the roof had been painted. Fake hedgerows crisscrossed the buildings. The chimney barn was functional. Wooden covers were in place over the railroad tracks and could be moved aside in under 3 minutes when supply trains arrived. From ground level, the factory looked like a construction site having a nervous breakdown. From 3,000 feet up, it was starting to look like random farmland. German reconnaissance photographed the site again on March 8th. Turner watched the plane pass and felt his stomach clench. This was the test. If the Germans saw through the camouflage now, bombers would be back within days. If they did not, the factory might survive. The intelligence report came back 3 days later. German photo analysts noted significant changes to the Westland roof, but assessed the modifications as anti-aircraft positions or bomb damage repairs with mismatched materials. No change in threat level. Target remained on active bombing lists, but was classified as moderately important rather than high priority. Turner read the report in Abbott's office. He sat down heavily in a chair and put his head in his hands. It was working. The Germans were looking directly at the camouflage and not recognizing it as camouflage. They thought it was construction activity. They thought it was damage repairs. They did not think it was a farm, but they also had not removed Westland from their target lists. That meant more raids were coming. The camouflage was 90% complete, but not perfect. There were still gaps, still sections that did not quite match the surrounding fields, still details that might catch a sharp-eyed photo analyst's attention. Turner spent the next week obsessing over those details. He walked the perimeter of the factory at different times of day, studying how light fell across the painted sections. He compared the roof colors to actual fields using binoculars. He found 3 areas where the brown tones were too uniform and did not match the irregular texture of real plowed earth. He had those sections repainted with deliberately sloppy technique to create variation. He discovered that one of the fake hedgerows was positioned at exactly 90 degrees to the building edge, which made it look artificial. Real hedgerows followed property lines and drainage patterns that ignored building geometry. He had the frame repositioned at a slight angle, so it no longer aligned with the factory structure. The railroad track covers were too clean. Real farm roads had ruts, puddles, and weed growth. Turner ordered the covers weathered with mud and scattered debris to make them look neglected. On March 14th, Abbott told him the ministry wanted a status report. Turner wrote a 1-page summary stating camouflage was complete and operationally effective. He did not mention Margaret, Elizabeth, or Thomas. He did not mention the 12-hour shifts or the design failures or the constant adjustments. He just said the factory was ready and recommended maintaining the camouflage indefinitely. The next night, Hauptmann Franz Dietrich flew his bombing run and could not find the target. Turner was not there to see it. He was in his rented room above the chemist shop, asleep for the first time in 3 days. He did not hear the bombers pass overhead. He did not know that Dietrich had circled for 9 minutes searching for a factory that was directly below him. He only learned about it the next morning, when Abbott called and said the Germans had dropped their bombs on a farm 2 miles away and killed 14 cows. Turner walked to the factory and stood in the yard staring up at the roof. The camouflage looked exactly the same as yesterday. Nothing had changed, but somehow overnight it had become invisible to the people it was designed to fool. He thought about Margaret and Elizabeth. He thought about the night they had kept painting, while bombs fell around them. He wondered if they had known, in some way he could not explain, that what they were doing mattered enough to die for. Oberst Heinrich Ritter had not left his office in 6 hours. The reconnaissance photos were spread across every available surface: his desk, the filing cabinet, the floor. 16 images arranged in chronological order from January through mid-March, all showing the same target: Westland Aircraft Works, Yeovil, England. He picked up the magnifying glass for the 20th time and examined the March 15th photo. The one taken the same day, Hauptmann Dietrich had circled over empty farmland for 9 minutes, searching for a factory that intelligence swore was there. Ritter could see the factory, but only because he had spent the last 6 hours training his eyes to recognize what should not be possible. The outline was there. The dimensions matched previous photos exactly. The railroad tracks ran to the same loading docks, but everything else had changed in ways that violated basic logic. The uniform gray roofing from January had been replaced by irregular patches of brown, tan, and gray-green. Not random, deliberate. The colors matched agricultural land visible in the surrounding countryside: plowed fields, fallow ground, pastures. Someone had repainted an 11-acre industrial complex to look like farmland. Linear structures ran across the roofs at odd angles. Ritter traced them with his finger. They looked like hedgerows. Not real hedgerows growing from soil. Artificial structures built on the roof surface and designed to cast shadows that matched vegetation. The hedgerows broke up the rectangular building outline into irregular sections that mimicked separate agricultural plots. The 3 chimneys were gone. In January, they had been prominent vertical features impossible to miss. In March, they had vanished entirely. Ritter searched the area where the main chimney had stood and found a cluster of shapes that looked like collapsed farm buildings. Possibly a barn that had partially fallen in. Definitely not a functioning industrial chimney pumping smoke. He set down the magnifying glass and rubbed his eyes. They burned from staring at photos under artificial light. His head ached. He had skipped lunch and dinner because stopping meant accepting what he was seeing, and accepting it meant admitting the British had accomplished something he would not have believed possible. They had made a factory invisible, not by moving it, not by destroying it, by teaching it to impersonate the countryside around it. A knock on the door. Corporal Ernst Weber entered without waiting for permission. Weber looked as exhausted as Ritter felt. He had been analyzing the same photos in the intelligence section since Dietrich's report arrived. Weber carried a folder thick with notes. He set it on the desk and started talking before Ritter could ask questions. He said the color patterns on the Westland roof matched agricultural textures within a 5-mile radius of the factory. Dark brown matched recently plowed fields photographed 3 weeks earlier. Tan matched fallow ground. Gray-green matched winter pastures with sheep grazing. Someone had studied aerial reconnaissance photos of the surrounding area and replicated those exact color distributions on the factory roof. Ritter asked how long this would have taken. Weber opened his folder and showed comparison photos. The transformation had occurred gradually between late February and mid-March. Approximately 4 weeks of continuous work. 4 weeks during which Ritter's squadrons had hit the target 3 times. Workers must have been painting camouflage between raids, possibly during raids. Weber pointed at another detail. The fake hedgerows were not simple painted lines. They were 3-dimensional structures that cast real shadows visible in the photos. The construction indicated someone understood how aerial reconnaissance interpreted shadow patterns. Real hedgerows created specific shadow angles based on sun position and vegetation density. The British had replicated those shadow characteristics using wooden frames and canvas. The railroad tracks presented the most sophisticated element. Weber showed a close-up of the track area. The rails were still there but appeared faint, almost ghost-like. Something had been placed over them to obscure the visual signature while maintaining functionality. Probably removable wooden panels painted to look like dirt roads or overgrown paths. The panels would be moved aside when trains arrived, then replaced immediately after. Ritter asked if the camouflage would fool bomber crews indefinitely. Weber said yes at normal reconnaissance altitude, no at low level. But low-level reconnaissance over England meant unacceptable casualties from anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. The British did not need perfect deception. They needed good enough deception at safe altitudes. Ritter stood and walked to the wall map. The red pin marking Yeovil mocked him. That pin represented priority target status, high value, confirmed production, 20 reconnaissance aircraft per week. His squadrons had hit it 6 times with verified results. Damage assessments showed direct hits. Casualty reports confirmed British losses. Everything indicated success. But intelligence reports kept showing the factory was still operational, still producing, still functioning. And now, Dietrich could not find it despite accurate navigation. Ritter pulled the pin from the map and held it between his fingers. He asked Weber, who designed this camouflage system. Weber said British intelligence had not identified the individuals responsible. Probably military engineers with specialized training in deception techniques. Ritter disagreed. Military engineers thought in terms of netting and decoy structures. This was different. Someone with agricultural expertise and aerial survey experience had designed this. Someone who understood what fields looked like from altitude and how human visual perception processed landscape patterns. Someone desperate enough or clever enough to attempt something most people would consider insane. Weber asked what Ritter wanted to do. Ritter said he wanted authorization for a low-level reconnaissance to confirm the camouflage and identify weaknesses. Weber pointed out that request would be denied. Luftwaffe High Command did not authorize low-level flights over defended English territory without extraordinary justification. A factory that might be camouflaged was not extraordinary justification. Ritter knew Weber was right. He drafted a report anyway. Detailed description of the camouflage system, photo comparisons showing the transformation, explanation of why Dietrich's mission had failed, recommendation for updated reconnaissance procedures and possible low-level verification flights. The report went up the chain of command. 3 days later, a brief response came back. High Command acknowledged the information, noted the technique for potential German defensive application, did not authorize follow-up reconnaissance, advised operational efficiency priorities. Ritter read the response twice and understood what it meant. The Luftwaffe had decided Westland was too difficult to locate reliably. Resources would be better utilized against easier targets. The factory was being quietly downgraded. He called a meeting with his squadron leaders. 6 officers gathered in the briefing room. Ritter explained the situation without softening it. The British had camouflaged the Westland Works to look like farmland. Bomber crews could no longer reliably identify the target from safe altitude. Future missions to that area would focus on other objectives with clearer visual signatures. Hauptmann Dietrich asked if they were abandoning the target. Ritter said no. He said they were acknowledging reality. A target that required extensive search time while burning fuel and exposing crews to defensive fire was not operationally viable. There were easier ways to damage British aircraft production. One of the younger officers, a lieutenant named Fisher, said the British should not be allowed to win through trickery. Ritter asked what Fisher proposed. Fisher had no answer. Ritter told him war was not about fairness. It was about results. If the British could remove a target from Luftwaffe reach, using paint and wood, that was a result. The meeting ended. Squadron leaders returned to their units. Within a week, mission planning documents reflected the new reality. Westland Works, downgraded from high priority to low priority. Strike if opportunity arose, but do not dedicate resources to searching for it. Ritter pinned one of the March photos to his office wall, not as decoration, as a reminder. The British had beaten German reconnaissance through ingenuity and desperation. Someone over there had looked at an impossible problem and solved it with paint. 3 months passed. Summer arrived. Ritter's squadrons focused on ports, rail yards, and power stations. Targets that could not hide. The Westland factory faded from daily operations. Bomber crews assigned to southern England marked Yeovil on their maps but rarely recommended missions there. In September, a new batch of reconnaissance photos arrived as part of routine surveillance. Ritter sorted through them looking for changes in British industrial capacity. One photo showed the Yeovil area. He stopped, put down the other photos, picked up his magnifying glass. The Westland camouflage was still there, but the colors had changed. He pulled out the March photo for comparison. In March, the roof sections had been dark brown and tan to match late winter agricultural patterns. In September, they were lighter, more yellow tones. Some sections showed green that had not been there before. Ritter set both photos side by side. The color changes match seasonal variations in real farmland. Spring crops had grown, fields had been harvested, soil had been turned. The British had adjusted their camouflage to match those seasonal changes. Someone was maintaining this system, monitoring reconnaissance photos, repainting sections, updating colors to ensure the factory continued blending into the landscape as seasons changed. This was not a one-time emergency measure. This was permanent operational procedure. Ritter sat down heavily in his chair. He had assumed the camouflage was a desperate gamble that would degrade over time. Weather would fade the paint. Storms would damage the fake structures. Eventually, the deception would fail, and the target would become visible again. But the British were maintaining it, adapting it, improving it. They had committed to making their factory permanently invisible through ongoing effort. He thought about the workers who must be on those roofs every few months, repainting sections, adjusting colors, maintaining fake hedgerows, all while knowing German reconnaissance might photograph them at any time, all while knowing another raid could come if the camouflage failed. Some of those workers had probably died during his raids. He had read casualty reports. British civilian deaths at Westland were listed in intelligence summaries. 17 in the first raid, 9 in the second, 12 in the third. He had never thought about what those people were doing when the bombs fell. Now he wondered if some of them had been on the roofs with paintbrushes in their hands. Weber entered without knocking. He had seen the September photos. He asked if Ritter wanted to update the target assessment. Ritter asked what Weber recommended. Weber said the assessment should note camouflage system remained active and seasonally maintained. Target classification should remain low priority with annotation that visual identification required extensive search time. Ritter told him to file the update. Weber hesitated. He asked if Ritter wanted to recommend another attempt at the target. Ritter said no. He said they should let it go. Weber looked surprised. Ritter explained the British had won this particular fight. They had removed a legitimate military target from operational reach through clever deception and sustained effort. Continuing to chase it would waste resources for minimal gain. Weber left. Ritter updated his operations log. Westland Works confirmed active. Camouflage maintained and seasonally adjusted. Target classification unchanged. Low priority. Recommended action, none. He filed the September photo with the others and returned to planning missions against targets that could not hide. The Westland Works remained on his wall. The factory had disappeared under paint in March and stayed invisible through sheer determination. 20 reconnaissance aircraft per week still rolling off assembly lines the Luftwaffe could no longer find. The red pin never went back on the map. Margaret died with a paintbrush in her hand. Dietrich never knew her name. Ritter spent 2 years thinking about her. This is what real war looks like. Not Hollywood. If you stayed for this story, you're the audience we need. Subscribe. Comment what you think Ritter should have told Margaret's family after the war. There's no right answer.